So let's begin with the concept of communicative competence, which is very old in the tradition of sociolinguistics. Goes back to Delheims. So the classic paper in 1972, when he talked about communicative competence. So that would be some kind of a landmark, milestone. Talk about that notion of competence. And I think one other name that comes to mind would be John Gompertz, not just Delheims. So those two work with this concept quite a lot together, but also separately. And the reason why Himes came up with that was central to the development of sociolinguistics as a discipline, as opposed to linguistics of the Chomskyan, Noam Chomsky's kind. So communicative competence for Delheims became an opposition between linguistic competence versus communicative competence. So linguistic competence is what Chomsky talked about, that we all are born with a language acquisition device. We have some kind of an innate ability to learn languages, particularly the native language. We can create well-formed sentences. We can be very creative. We can know what is correct and what is not correct grammatically. So Chomsky was talking about there is a universal grammar. Okay? So everybody has the capacity to learn and use language. You don't need to interact. You don't need to be socially relevant. You don't need to have any training in skills. It's all there. So that's what Chomsky talked about as linguistic competence. So when it came to Himes, you can also talk about Halliday and Gompertz and a few other sociolinguists who said that's not entirely true. We are all social beings. So we have to be competent through communication, through interaction, through socializing. So sociolinguistics, anthropology, social psychology, these would be the disciplines who began to think about the notion of communicative competence, but we will attribute it to Delheims as the originator of the concept. So the classic difference is linguistic competence is about grammar, about language form, language structure, about correctness, what is correct and what is incorrect. So that's important, but that's not the whole story. So now we have to think about language function. So language use. So it's not about correctness, but about appropriateness. What's relevant in a particular context? What's relevant to say this to a particular audience, a particular addressee, how we talk to children and how to talk to parents, how we talk to clients, how we talk to fellow professionals. So what is appropriate? So correctness is linguistic form, structure, linguistic competence. Communicative competence is language use. It's about appropriateness. Of course, we need linguistic competence before we can be communicatively competent. So it's not an either-or scenario. But actually, communicative competence, as far as I can tell, and many psychologists might show that with data and evidence, children become communicatively competent first, before they even know language. So communicative competence can exist without language use. Without language knowledge, if you like. So there are two things that Himes said which are very important to think about the notion of competence, communicative competence. One is that without the rules of language use, the rules of language are useless. In other words, just knowing the grammar, memorizing the dictionary is not being competent. So he argued that and said there are occasions when we should be what he called appropriately ungrammatical, appropriately incorrect. So in other words, there are situations where being incorrect is more appropriate than being correct. Like when you try to empathize with somebody who is in stress. Like in the operating theater, the surgeons don't talk full grammatical sentences. So there are many occasions where just a few words which are not syntactically correct might be far more appropriate and relevant to the context than being a grammatician or grammatically, correct, if you like. So that's what I would take as the notion of communicative competence, going back to sociolinguistics and Himes. And you can see how sociolinguistics is now looking or connecting to pragmatics. So Himes was actually connecting, not very explicitly, to pragmatics, which is the study of language use, just like sociolinguistics. So the classic book of John Austin, How to Do Things with Words, how to apologize, how to make a request, how to give advice, how to give an instruction, they have to be relevant, appropriate, not just grammatically correct. So you can see a connection between sociolinguistics of Himes and some kind of a more functionalist perspective on language use in pragmatics. Also, the Grice's maxims and the cooperative principle, how much to say when, the quantity, the quality, the manner, and the relation. So that's what I see as communicative competence. And one more point just to make before we move to expertise. Just like I contrasted communicative competence with linguistic competence, at the very root of this concept of competence is it's different from performance. So we need to make a distinction very broadly, very generally, about performance versus competence. So when we talk about ourselves as language, communication, discourse scholars, we may not be able to access competence. We can only access performance. How people talk, how people write, how the website looks. So these are all performances, text, talk, other semiotic, multimodal modes, if you like. So then the question comes, does it mean that we are irrelevant when it comes to judging, assessing, studying competence? And my answer is, of course not. It is through performance we can have some kind of an assessment of competence. So when we read somebody's exam scripts, it's a performance, but we know what competence that student has. So in the curriculum, we talk about what are the competencies, but all the competencies must be manifest at the level of performance. Just like a screening result or a test result, that's a performance, but we can look at it competently. Or a very good example would be the job interview. So when people are going for a job interview and they're being interviewed, it's a performance. But what the interviewers are trying to assess is the competence behind the performance. So is this candidate competent enough to deliver the tasks, to meet the challenges for which we need this person. So performance is the indicator of competence, both in everyday life, but of course, very importantly, in many professional settings like healthcare. So that's about competence, communicative competence versus linguistic competence and performance, if you like. Does that address your first question?
Absolutely.